Good afternoon. I am excited to welcome everyone here. My name is Laura Schultz. I'm the Executive Director of Research here at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And thank you for signing on for our third webinar in a series. Today, we are having an important discussion about how New York's workforce is changed as a result of COVID-19 and how educators, workforce developers, and policymakers can help prepare the state's workers for the upcoming recovery. Before the pandemic started, Institute researchers were exploring trends that would be impacting the nature of work and workers over the coming decade. We explored how automation was going to be integrated into service and hospitality work. We looked into the growing teleworkforce and its impact on communities. And we explored the emergence of gig work and what it meant for employees and employers. In March, these trends that we had expected to unfold over the next decade were realized overnight. Over 20 million workers lost their jobs in the immediate aftermath of closures, and only half of those people have returned to work. Those that still worked saw dramatic changes in what they did and how they did it. Companies had to identify new ways to do business, and employees needed to learn new skills. The landscape of work has shifted dramatically, and now we need to reimagine how to prepare people for work. So today, we have brought together experts and practitioners from the field of workforce development in New York State. I want to thank Lizette Nieves, President of the Fund for the City of New York and Nathan Fellow at the Rockefeller Institute, Melinda Mack, Executive Director of the New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals, and Karen Coleman, Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Development and the Governor's Office Advisor on Workforce Policy and Innovation for the New York State Department of Labor, for joining us today for this conversation. Our moderator today is Jason Russell. Jason is an associate professor at SUNY Empire State College, where he coordinates the MA program in work and labor policy. Jason is an author of Our Union, a UAW-CAW Local 27 from 1950 to 1990, Making Managers in Canada, 1945 to 1995, Companies, Community Colleges, and Universities, and Leading Progress, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. He's published several journal articles and book chapters. He is also co-director and fellow at the Future of Labor Center here at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And with that, I welcome Jason to start today's conversation.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you again, everyone, for joining. Our first panel today, again, is Lizette Nieves. Lizette is a Nathan Fellow at the Rockefeller Institute and the president of the Fund for the City of New York, an institution charged with developing and helping to implement innovations in policy, programs, practices, and technology in order to advance the functioning of government and nonprofit organizations in New York City and beyond. Prior to the fund, Lizette was a director of educational leadership and policy studies and a full clinical professor at NYU Steinhardt. She also served as a founding executive director of Year Up New York, an innovative workforce development program, where in the span of 5 years, she grew the organization from a $250 seed grant to a $6 million operation with over 20 corporate partnerships. Her interest in workforce and education led to her dissertation on the relationship between student work and student roles, for which she received the 2016 Dissertation of the Year Award by the NCSD/AACC. Her areas of research interest include community colleges, college pathways, and workforce and education partnerships. So welcome, Lizette Nieves.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Another key part of my bio is born and raised and proud to be from New York City. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to walk through a PowerPoint presentation today, and I'm going to talk about the analysis of COVID-19's impact on workforce development and higher education in New York State. Now, I want to preface this with, I'm glad that I get to go first, because I also get to recognize, and you'll see cite some of the great work that the rest of the panel is doing in this as well. All right, so let's look at the state of New York, right? When we look at the state of New York, let's look at what we consider the multi-sector job losses. right? When we see those losses as compared to the United States, New York State, as Laura had mentioned, 1.3 million as of July in losses. And when you look across the state, look at what you're noticing and seeing in different counties. This is a burden that we share across the state, but we can't ignore particular changes or things that we see in certain areas. We look at Albany with 13%. We look at Glen Falls with 16, right? We think about all of these areas that we have, and obviously the city down in New York City, right? We're talking about job losses. This is an important thing to recognize because it's a burden that we share across the state. Just gonna keep moving us through. Now, when we think about this one too, let's look at in here, what are the particular widespread unemployment, as I said earlier. Look at us overall here at our unemployment rates. These are also as of July. Now, I want us to acknowledge, and one thing that I think is pretty important, is that this widespread unemployment, that even the impacts that you see, even if there's slight upticks, that's because there was stimulus or PPP or CARES, however you want to describe it, money that went into the economy, went into individuals, right? And so if we were to look at the most updated numbers, or if we were to do this chart, I would say as of December, I think it would be much more staggering and even have greater impact as far as seeing the numbers across. And again, look at what we see across the state and sharing that, okay? Now I'm looking at, we think about this one too. Let's look at the city employment changes here as well. So this 20% decline in New York City employment was equivalent to the loss, think about that, of an unprecedented over 900,000 jobs between February and April. The city did recover somewhat, adding 128,000 jobs from April to June, right? But again, think about the role of stimulus and think about the role that had an impact on this particular slide. Okay. But this is one where please get your reading glasses out if you're my age or older. I want to point this one out. But I think one thing that's really important is to think about low-wage workers, right? While the total unemployment rate slightly recovered, having decreased by 9.3% of September 3rd, 2020, I'm giving you some more updates, compared to January 2020, we've seen thus far that low-wage workers continue to experience the greatest losses in jobs and wages. And this is according to Opportunity Insights. So I want to really recognize that. Low-wage workers have taken a brunt of the hit in this. All right. Now, an area that I care deeply about and that I have worked in both as a practitioner and as a scholar is looking particularly at young people and looking how this crisis has impacted them. Most recent report by the New York City Comptroller, we talk about communities of color and young people are bearing the brunt of the unemployment crisis. And so the next few slides are really going to go deeper into that there. All right. I want to highlight, if you hear a siren or anything else, welcome to local Brooklyn background noise, okay? So hopefully you could still hear me clearly in there. This is the national employment rate by age. If you can see these numbers there too, I hope that's clear to folks. Are we seeing those there? I always want to make sure, sometimes my slides aren't always as clear. And look at what we're seeing over time and changes. And I think this one's going to be important as we go to slide 9. I am so inspired by the work that Mathematica just recently did on looking at youth unemployment. It's probably one of the best deep dives I've seen in a long time on this, right? And it looks at youth unemployment before and after COVID by age group. And that's not always easy to get that kind of information, right? And when we look at that, according to this ongoing 2-year project that's happening, right? More than a quarter of young people were unemployed within a month after most states implemented stay-at-home policies. If we break it down even further, 32% of young people between the ages of 16 to 19 and 26% of young people between the ages of 20 and 24 were unemployed. In May 2020, the unemployment rate decreased slightly, but a quarter of young people ages 16 to 24 still unemployed, right? So this is not even counting those who had never entered or were not able to enter the market. I think this is an important thing for folks to also consider too. And the reason why I feel so strong about including this slide in here and the work that I do is that, early workforce engagement is real indicative of continued persistent workforce engagement. I believe that it's part of a developmental milestone. I write about it that way. I feel strongly about that. And I hope that we recognize when we're thinking about COVID kind of strategies and impacts or changes and how we can rebuild the economy, that we specifically think about strategies for young people. So here's one that's, I finally is, look at this, so clear, so clean, this graph. And I had never seen it put in this way before too. When we break it down by race and ethnicity, look particularly at young people versus working age adults. Look at the distinctions in that, right? It's stark. It's stark, right? And this is at the same time too, where you have to understand where we're actually seeing people within the ages of 16 to 24 say, I am not going to go to college right now and put the year off to work. But look, they're entering the market at the worst time. All right. So that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind, this idea of, particularly for more vulnerable young adults, this gap year romantic notion of I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Look at the market opportunities, right? All right. So on this slide, this is monthly unemployment by gender, race, and ethnicity from January to May. And look at these numbers right here. And some in particular, we think about that. Let's look at from male to female, right? So we see that it started out with a higher kind of unemployment rate, thinking of male, and then ended with a higher one by female, right? We're also seeing particularly the impacts of seeing women of color when we break that down as well too, and young people. These numbers and this kind of segmentation or this kind of data is important because when we talk about strategies for recovery, we should look at this. And it also tells us geographically what strategies may work better in certain areas than other areas. Now we're on slide 12. And this one is, we're thinking about youth unemployment in New York State, right? So the change in the unemployment rate, you see no surprise there too. It's supporting the narrative that we've had here, that it's a burden that's not just being shared by everyone, but it's also being shared by young people and disproportionately by young people. Okay. So we think particularly of minority communities, communities of color, what are we seeing in change in unemployment rates, right? This is a fascinating one too, because it's also important that in many of the others, you may not always able to get, particularly on youth, that I particularly like to see, we're seeing who's in the service sector here. We're seeing where some major changes are in the service sector here, particularly for people of color. We see some of the greatest shifts that are happening. A community that's not often talked about is particularly the Asian as far as employments, and seeing some of the shifts that are happening there. What are the economies or the particular sectors that they're working in there? So I wanted to highlight that as well. And now we're looking at share of adults living in a household that lost employment. And I included this one because this slide for me is really important. So often when we think about young people in the labor market, we think about it as pocket money or things like that. The truth is it's not. It's part of what we call a family wage and contributing to a household so often. And so this is why when we see, a loss of employment in a household, we should also understand young people being part of this equation too, and taking away from as what we think about as far as a family wage. Here's a graph on foreign-born workers. Now, I want to say this, I could do this PowerPoint over an hour, and I know I'm going through them pretty quick and people will have access to these slides, but that's just because they have me going before all the other headliners. So I'm just letting you know, you're going to get to hear about this a little bit more later as people go through it a bit more in depth, okay? So when we're looking on this slide, we're looking at the graph of foreign-born workers. And so what we're seeing here too is look at the impacts of what's happened over time, right? It's fascinating. And this is particularly important when you're thinking about the New York City economy and the loss of jobs. Without this slide, you don't have as much context for New York City, particularly thinking when over a third of New York City's foreign-born. So it puts that in perspective. All right, there's a few movements that are happening right now that some people are not surprised at seeing here too, just giving you a sense of what it looks like in New York City and other places when you're walking around. And so there's this notion that there are disrupted pathways to success, right? And so I want to go a little bit more into this. And some of this is some great work that's also been done by Jobs First New York City. And some of this is what we call the insights from the field. And so, you know, I'm just going to highlight a couple because I know Melinda Mack is going to talk about some of these and I don't want to take that away too. You know, the pandemic's causing young adults to face greater competition for jobs, internships, and work-based learning experiences, right? Just at the time when we were having what I call an elevated discussion on the connection between economic opportunity and educational opportunity, we're also seeing that there is a disruption in that, right? I think that's a pretty important piece too. The other part is this transition to remote teaching and learning is not meeting all the needs. There's this, you know, people say, is it an education crisis? Karen Coleman, who's going to be speaking here too, she is a former teacher. I would call it an engagement crisis in some ways, right? So what you'll see is that people, you may have more people logging on, but are they engaged? And so we see all kinds of things. And maybe that's when I'm saying too much as a mother of a teenager. Yeah, I'll just leave that right there. But there are a few other key insights. And like I said, Melinda will go through those a bit more in depth. I want to talk a little bit about the organizations because we could talk about research, but what's happening in practice in mobilizing movement and energy around COVID recovery and the impacts. And what I do say is that we never want to waste the opportunity of what disruption can mean. And the opportunity of disruption is that you get people to talk across silos in a way they have not done before. So some of them, look at these incredible organizations that are here, and I really encourage you to learn a little bit more about them too. But let's just say, for example, the Lower East Side Employment Network, it's a partnership between 8 community-based organizations. Community Board 3 operates in Lower East Side, connections between local job seekers and employers, right? The role of intermediaries and the role of these different groups that are neighborhood and place-based are critical to understanding a recovery for New York, right? So at times when we are in crisis, we actually have to open the umbrella or the tent more to include folks who are the most proximate. Okay, and this just includes and continues with others that are in there as well too. So like I said, you'll have access to this PowerPoint presentation, but I really would urge you to get to know who these great groups are. All right, so when I'm almost done, so I want to be sensitive to time and so that everyone is not exhausted by the end of my presentation, I want us to really look at this idea of state level solutions, right? And when we think about that, we can't just think in cities. So I'm gonna just move us right through. And we look here too, what are some immediate actions that we could think about at the state level? You saw on the slide before, what is a local level or what does it mean to be very proximate and engaged players we could have? This is at a state level that we should be thinking about. And Melinda Mack will go into some more of these too. But you know, this idea of how do we think about dedicating more money to federal workforce innovation, right? But doing it in a way with players and partnerships that I would say if it were not for this crisis, may not have been at the same table. I could say that. I have seen more people at a table in a way that I haven't before. When you have a health crisis and an economic crisis and a childcare crisis and all these things at once, all of a sudden you have an opportunity for people like administrators, and I think of the work that Karen Coleman does that can bring together folks and think about opportunities that are truly cross-sectoral that are about rebuilding during this crisis, right? I want to highlight one in particular. I want to think about allowing 10% of contract funding to be attributed to administrative expenses. We cannot ignore that right now. What does it mean for someone right now to actually manage and run a grant? What does it mean for the overhead of that? That is something in general for the nonprofit sector that could be at any conference that I could speak at, but I wanted to particularly mention that is here as well too. What are some short-term actions that we could think about? And I'm going to end on some of this too, right? I think we have a unique opportunity to be a leader nationally in this country on this. The same way that we've been able to decrease transmissions, we could be a leader in what a state and local municipalities and cities can do in recovery. Because we could think about it multi-pronged. We could say, we're not going to do it in the way we thought of recessions in the past, where let's just do some more infrastructure building, because that's not really is going to get at as much of the young people or the women of color who've been disproportionately hit. So we want to think a little bit differently that way. I think that's going to be a model for this country, right? I also think that we have a level of sophistication of intermediaries that you do not see around the country in the same way. I'm really proud of that. I think that's another way that we can do that, right? And the third is that we have already a sophisticated, what I call conversation around workforce. And the way that I talk to colleagues in other states, they're just trying to put in infrastructure to have. So I'm going to end on this slide and just say, I'm proud to be here. I'm inspired that I'm here with my colleagues on this panel. And let's use this opportunity to really say in crisis that we are going to be bigger, we're going to be bolder, we're going to be audacious, and truly be innovative to make the greatest impact in the city and state. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Lizette. Our next presenter is Melinda Mack. Melinda is the Executive Director of the New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals, NIATEP, a leading nonprofit membership association in the field of workforce development. As a systems change champion, she advocates for investment in and expansion of promising and evidence-based practices to improve outcomes for New Yorkers, the use of data to drive decision-making, and eliminating silos that deter from high-quality services. As a nationally recognized workforce policy expert, Melinda has been called before Congress to testify on the need for workforce development investment and regularly advises federal and state leadership on policy making and implementation. She is co-lead of the Invest in Skills New York initiative and campaign that successfully engaged the state in 2018 to invest $175 million in job training and workforce development. In her previous roles, Melinda was the founding director for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation program, Graduate NYC, and served as the acting executive director for the New York City Workforce Board under the Bloomberg administration. Before working in New York City, Melinda worked in upstate New York and local government and municipal finance and economic development in Buffalo and Albany. So please welcome Melinda Mack.
Thank you, Jason. And to echo Lizette, I'm really honored to be here with Karen and with Lizette, two people who I have looked up to for a long time and have taught me a lot about workforce development throughout my career. And I'm really also pleased to be able to present some of the concepts that were delivered as part of the New York State Workforce Strategy Group work, which is a compilation of partners from across New York State, really looking to think about, as Lizette shared, how we use this as an opportunity to move ahead a lot of the great work that not only private philanthropy, but the state has invested in over the last couple of years and last decade, and in many ways accelerate what we know are national best practices. And so I was really pleased to be able to help convene this group and facilitate this group. It included a cross-section of the business community, organized labor, it included workforce professionals, community colleges, BOCES programs, you sort of name it. And we duked it out sort of behind the scenes around what really could be priorities that we could create. I was joking, anybody who can get 35 New Yorkers around a table and get them to agree to something, I feel like we deserve some kind of medal here. But in reality, it comes down to being really pragmatic and practical, also recognizing, as Lizette mentioned, although we're also in an economic crisis, we're in a fiscal crisis for the state as well. And so how do we sort of use what we've got better, but also how do we make sure the big ideas are still on the table so we know that we can be transformative through this work? I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but one thing I do want to mention that I think is important is prior to COVID, the economy was doing well, but it was not great for everybody. And I think it's important that we start with a recognition that there was an explosion in growth of low-wage work across the state. About 2 million of the top occupations that we had across the state paid less than $32,000 a year. And so we often joke, is it a field of dreams situation, right? Maybe dating myself here, but do we have to have better jobs, better paying jobs in order to have higher educational attainment across the state? Or do we need higher educational attainment to attract and retain better jobs? One of the challenges we faced in the state for a long time, and this number always shocks people when we talk about it, 42% of New Yorkers have a high school diploma or less, And so again, when we're thinking about how we're approaching this economic crisis, we actually have to really think about who is being underutilized in the labor market and how we're attaching those folks to the right skills and right credentials in order to be able to maximize, again, their full potential in the labor market. And so again, I share this, in contrast and in collaboration with some of the data that Lizette shared, because we have in some ways a confluence of many major issues that we're trying to address at once. I was on a call earlier today and someone was asking, well, how are you guys going to solve the childcare crisis? And I thought, we can't solve the childcare crisis in workforce. I can't solve the K-12 crisis in workforce. We're trying to figure out our little tiny space here around how to do this work, but it is showing how interdisciplinary a lot of the problems are and why the partnership work moving forward is so important. So this group came together, and one of the first things that we did, and I think it's important for this conversation, is we did a full debrief. We actually had our friends from the Heldrick Center, Carl Van Horn, came, and we really talked through what were some of the things we've learned from prior recessions. What are the things we know we don't want to repeat? What are the things we want to repeat because they went well? And a couple of the ones that I want to highlight. One of the biggest ones was not to get tempted by the shiny things, right? We always hear a huge surge or huge investment in one sector or one type of occupation. During the last recession, it was clean energy jobs. Again, part of the challenge at that point is the labor market hadn't caught up with the development of the actual job opportunities. I think it would be different now if we invested in clean energy, especially in New York with the governor's massive investment in workforce and sort of economic growth related to clean energy. But at the time, we didn't quite have the number of jobs that we needed to meet the demand. And so I think for us, it's really around how do we double down and invest in the system that already exists, but really also expand and scale the opportunities really for the underutilized talent that are there. That was the second biggest piece that we talked about, was that we have to be able to meet the needs of the people coming in the door. We have to be able to meet the needs of the businesses who are looking to hire. And we're often sort of struggling to be able to match the dollars and the ability to spend the dollars on what people need the most. We are not going to train our way out of this. There's no possible way. There's not even enough capacity in the workforce system statewide to get as many people in and through training that would be necessary to be able to attach them to employment. And so we have to, again, be thoughtful and think about how we use the resources we already have to support this transition. The last two things I want to point out on this slide is the recovery is going to be slow. It's going to be slow in many of those first-time jobs that Lizette was mentioning before. It's going to take a long time to recover. We just had our conference the last 2 days, and we did a full session around with business leaders in hospitality, retail, tourism. They're really saying 2022 is when we expect to be back. And so when you think about that slow ride, that slow recovery, what does it look like to reattach people to employment and subsidized wages so they can still make their ends meet in their own lifestyles and own families, but also be able to adapt their skills to potentially new occupations and sectors. And then lastly, we can't forget, especially in a state like New York, a huge proportion of the resources that are invested in workforce development are federal dollars. And so as we think about recovery, the next stimulus, depending on whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, it has to include the workforce dollars. Because if it doesn't, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for us to be able to really build up any kind of structure that's responsive to the massive need that we're seeing. So this group came together, as Lizette shared a couple of the recommendations, and really settled on 3 buckets. The first was around how we stabilize the economy and get people back to work. How do we increase the pipeline of workers ready for work when the economy rebounds? And then how do we not waste this opportunity and really think about 2-3 years out, how we're structuring and rethinking some of the systems that have been in place for a long time that have to just adapt because the economy around us has changed and we need to be able to be meeting the needs of people in a different way. So thematically, I'm not going to go in super detail of the specific recommendations, but if folks are interested, I'm certainly willing to share the report, and we'll hand it out to the folks here at the Rockefeller Institute. But the key themes that came out is that we really have to stabilize small businesses. We know that they're about half of employment in all of New York. And ultimately, as we talk through this, especially with many of the chambers of commerce who participated, they are also tending to be the first place that people who tend to have barriers to employment access jobs, right? So it's hard for you to walk into a Home Depot or Lowe's and be able to get a job after filling out an online application, but it's much easier to walk into your corner store where they know you and say, hey, listen, I'm a hard worker, can I get a job, and get employment? And so we really need to make sure we keep those small businesses open and alive. We know we need to better use existing federal and state resources and really expand on the flexibility that the state has already provided. We weren't doing a ton of virtual or remote services in advance of COVID. We're doing a ton of them now. And the expectation, I think, of customers in particular is that they're always going to be able to do some of this work online moving forward. And so I think we want to make sure we're continuing to have some of that flexibility moving ahead. The last two are really, really important. We have to have better jobs. We have to have better jobs in our state. We've got to grow better jobs. We have to deepen the connection of economic and workforce development. I know under this governor, under Karen's leadership, there's been a ton more coordination between economic and workforce development. There's still a lot to do. It's the unfortunate reality. And especially when you get down to the local level, I think folks are just starting to understand the ways to operate together and the ways to coordinate. But in reality, we also need to provide the right incentives to change behavior, recognizing that we're not always throwing the best jobs, jobs with benefits, jobs with family sustaining wages in regional and local economies. We think there's a couple of quick wins. Again, we think we need to provide some CARES Act resources and investment directly to the small business community for subsidized wages. We also really think that we need to redirect some of the existing funding and hopefully new funding that can come to the state through the stimulus to provide work supports. Again, what we're hearing on the ground is not everybody is going to need training. We have people who have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, but they can't make their mortgage payment. How do we figure out how to stabilize working New Yorkers so that they can get back to work? We also know we need to really think about how we direct funding to build the scale of adult ed and workforce providers. Again, our challenge we're seeing now, just even with our membership of NIATEP, is many are really behind on payments from government, whether it be state or local providers. They're having to lay their own staff off. So if we suddenly get an influx of several $100 million from the federal government, I'm not sure where we're going to find capacity. And so part of this is really stabilizing the existing capacity so that that support is there when folks are in need of it. And then finally, some of these foundational needs of the system. I think as Lizette shared, the data bears out what we've known all along. The labor market's not fair. It's not designed to be fair. And really, we have a role in making sure that there's more opportunity and equity within the system. And where I see the real role of government and foundation policy work is around making sure that that is a key and central motive to the work that we're doing. And so I think we're really hoping that we can address what we know are man-made or woman-made barriers that we've put in place over the years to be able to address equity and opportunity. What's really transformative in the recommendations are around stabilizing the working poor. I think, what we found, and the United Way puts out a great report for folks who are unfamiliar, it's called the ALICE report, where it's, they really sort of follow those who are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. These, again, are the working poor across New York. And it ranges, it doesn't matter where you live, whether you're in the North Country or Rochester, or if you're in the Southern Tier or on Long Island or New York City. It ranges anywhere between 45 and 60% of New Yorkers are considered to be working poor. That's crazy, right? We live in a state that is relatively rich in terms of its assets. And so we have to figure out ways to help and support people get ahead. So one of the things that we've recommended in the report is around income disregards and really figuring out asset building opportunities for individuals on TANF and food assistance, recognizing that often the way we've structured our public benefits is they cut off just as you get ahead, but it's not enough for you to say fix a flat tire or to catch up on your mortgage payment. And so we just need to provide a little bit more in order for folks to remain stable. Around opportunity, the big pieces that came up for us, and I know this is something that gets Lizette excited, but the first one is around prior learning credit and transferability of education. We had the SUNY and CUNY chancellor with us yesterday or 2 days ago, and they both talked about the need to address a common set of policies around prior learning. If you're in the military and you've done your service, you should be able to go to SUNY or CUNY and know that no matter what, your credit will transfer and will transfer equally, regardless of where you go. There's a lot of those types of pieces that really do limit people's opportunity and actually takes money out of their pockets as they're trying to catch up with the credits that they need. We also think you should be able to transfer your education from BOCES to a community college to a CTE program. It should be really clear. It should be easy to transition. It's not yet. I think there's interest and appetite to do it. There certainly are policy barriers that have to be shifted and changed, but these are all things that are doable with the right folks around the table. The last thing I will mention before I move on to sort of show you what the recommendations look like. we have to really focus on broadband access. And when I say access, we have to actually pay for people's broadband. We went down this rabbit hole around the digital divide, which I think many of us thought we had, really created a dent in. And I think especially we're in this experience of remote learning, remote work, broadband access is an issue in some places. The bigger issue is you can't afford it. So, we think there in some ways needs to be a fix that's similar to what we've done with heat, HEAP. So we have to have a heating program or some way to subsidize the actual broadband access for many New Yorkers, especially low-wage earners across the state. So these are the way we structured the recommendations. Again, I'm not going to go into each one in detail because I want to make sure Karen has enough time. But what I will say is the way that we sort of came to the conclusion of what we've came to here. First, they had to be based in evidence. So they had to be in existence somewhere else, or there had to be some evidence-based research that was associated with this set of recommendations. But also, they really needed to benefit all New Yorkers. And so we didn't specifically call out special populations, meaning young adults, people who were formerly incarcerated or returning citizens. We wanted to make sure that they were truly beneficial to all New Yorkers. But we also structured them in immediate actions that really, in many ways, were revenue neutral, and medium-term actions that we knew needed a little bit more conversation, and longer-term actions, which of course are sort of the big-ticket items. I am going to stop on this last one here in terms of big-ticket items. I think one, and Karen is probably so sick of me talking about this, but she's heard me talk about it forever. We need a consistent revenue stream for workforce development in New York State. The governor redirected existing resources in 2018. It was a huge first step. Of course, a lot of it was done because of New York State Department of Labor's leadership as well. But we don't have the same kind of revenue stream that, say, Texas or California or Massachusetts has. By way of example, Texas will raise around $110 million in revenue annually through one of their income deferral strategies. We just don't have that in our state. And so I think we'll consistently be behind in our ability to really think about our re-education and lifelong learning of New Yorkers if we don't think about the structural funding over the long term. So with that, I will stop there and make sure that Karen has a few moments as well.
Thank you, Melinda. Our final speaker is Karen Coleman. Karen serves as Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Development and Governor's Office Advisor on Workforce Policy and Innovation for the New York State Department of Labor. In this capacity, she oversees the development of policy and delivery of training and reemployment programs vital to hundreds of thousands of New York job seekers. Her experience includes many years of leadership roles at the agency, from special assistant to the commissioner, to leading workforce policy and planning activities, to oversight of the system of career centers. Her portfolio currently includes oversight of over $250 million in state and federally funded employment and training programs, notably the newly authorized Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Wagner-Pizer Veterans, the Apprenticeship Training Program, and the Trade Act program. Coleman represents New York State DOL on workforce issues related to economic development initiatives, notably Governor Andrew Cuomo's regional economic development councils, Empire State Poverty Reduction Initiative, and the Unemployment Strike Force. In addition, she provides hands-on management of New York State Department of Labor's proven business engagement programs aimed at spurring economic development and immediate hiring from the state talent bank by New York businesses. Karen is also executive staff of the State Workforce Investment Board, Apprenticeship Training Council, and the Hazard Abatement Board. In her role as Governor's Office Advisor for Workforce Policy and Innovation, Karen also focuses on growing industries and innovative programs and services to meet the workforce development needs. Please welcome Karen Coleman.
Thank you very much. And I do want to also say I'm very honored to be on a panel with friends and people that I've worked with a long time, but I know are passionate about the work that we do. And I say this to people all the time. You can work a long time in a place, and I have been here for 32 years. If you continue to be energized and surround yourself with people that you partner with that same kind of energy, you will still have results. Just do not ever get tired of the work that we do, because there is so much work to be done. So I was asked, as everyone else, is to kind of look at the infrastructure in this kind of recovery. I will say, just as a personal note, that I have also transitioned into a different role as a result of all of this, is what our findings. And I'm actually now the Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Policy and the Governor's Office Advisor for Workforce Policy and Innovation. And some of that is because as we're coming out of this, and it's going to take us a while to get out of this kind of into a recovery mode, there needs to be more structured policies within not only the department, but within the system as a whole. And while we have, and I'm starting with this screen of our infrastructure of 95 career centers, and we served last year 475,000 job seekers. We know that there's an infrastructure in place, but because the world is changing in so many ways, we need to start looking at what are some of those policy implications and not just on the operational side. As you know, Lizette and Melinda have raised in their presentations, you can see where we started unemployed workers in February, 354,000. And then in July, we had 1.5 million people that were considered unemployed. And in September, 886,500. Now, it's always confusing, the numbers, because there's a lot more people that were collecting unemployment, and our systems were strained tremendously from that situation, and still are in many ways. But these are people that are not going to be returning probably to their work. There were a lot of people that did return to their jobs, or they were furloughed in some way, or were on shared work, whatever that might be. So we know that, prior to COVID, we had one situation, and now we have to figure out how are we going to deal both in an infrastructure and policy way with all of the different, issues that we're facing that were very different. Many of us saw the other past recessions, and we know this is not anything like those past recessions. It might have been in a particular industry, the financial sector, or harder hit in many areas of the state. Now we have this very much statewide, national situation. So, and in fact, we know that there has been a lot of COVID disruption. Even in the Department of Labor, you can imagine, although I'm on the workforce development side, there's worker protection. One of our large divisions is devoted to the unemployment insurance benefits. When you have 3.5 million people calling into a system or looking or going online for benefits, the systems are not built for that. So there was a huge disruption. In particular, the unemployment insurance benefits are for those people that are unemployed. Their employers have paid into the system and they lost their job through no fault of their own. We had another whole layer of people that were self-employed, and the federal government came up with a program that helped individuals that were considered the pandemic unemployment assistance. Well, our systems were not built for that. So we know that where there's COVID disruption, there were a lot of issues that in the reality, there were topics that we've talked about in the past, but now they weren't necessarily new, and we had some new issues, but it was time to take action. We know that we've talked about automation, and we've had many, many companies that have taken leadership roles, in particular in New York State. We are a leader when it comes to the automation, advanced manufacturing. How do we develop different products in the aerospace world and IT, and every industry that we know had really moved towards an automation system. But now we're seeing more creative ways of using automation in order for people to have any level of business coming back. They've had to figure out, how do we change people-driven, people-to-people driven systems and experiences, and how do we bring in automation? These are not really creating new industries. As I said, it's about innovation within existing industries. There are, cobots, robots that are working alongside individuals, and robots themselves. We're looking at high tech, robots now, and how they are doing many, many jobs. And we had heard about, cars that are going to be driverless cars. And people have been saying to us for a long time, does that mean that we're not going to be training any, more CDLs, right? Or whatever that occupation is. And we know, well, there's going to be a transition. We will start to see a lot of these that we thought would be coming maybe in 10 years or 20 years. We will start seeing this collapse of the industries themselves into more of an automation, and to try to figure out how do we do our jobs in more of an automative way. We had redeployment, and I will speak firsthand, if you will. I oversee, and I oversaw at that time, about 1,000 individuals that are in the workforce development side of the house. They work at the career centers, the 95 career centers that I spoke about on the first slide. They worked here on policy and program development. We redeployed all 1,000 of our staff within workforce development into the unemployment system. We had contractors that we contracted with. We still are doing that. But the sheer numbers, we had a number that in 1 week, we had 8.5 million calls coming into the Department of Labor. You saw the horror stories. We heard the horror stories. We felt the horror stories of people that were being cut off as a result of the fact that they couldn't get into systems. So we redeployed, just as many companies had to redeploy their staff in a different way in order to make sure that as we are continuing to keep our infrastructure, we have to figure out what do people need most. And in that situation, they needed benefits to put food on their family's table, to have rent in some way, and some, able to provide for their family. So what we're seeing now is the redeployment of some workers. This has been happening on a micro level within a single company or a single office, but we've always thought about those jobs as physical, manual, repetitive, and require only basic skills. Now we see all the way to the macro level with a shift away from whole industries that were strong in the past. How do we keep our current staff that have some great skills, we have a great working relationship with, but how do we make sure that they are now being able to continue to provide for whatever that business need is? We know this remote and flexible work time. It's not even just about work, it's about educational structures. There was, schedules are much more flexible now. It's been interesting. So even at the Department of Labor, we were leaders at the statewide level for government workers on a telecommute program. We had started this pilot probably 1.5 years ago. And there were so many managers that would say, oh yeah, no, our staff cannot work remotely. No, we have to be here in the office. They have to do this, on a regular basis, on person to person. And then what happened on March, 15th, actually it was the Sunday before that, I called all my managers in and said, okay, starting this week, there's going to be a lot of remote learning and working at home. And how are you, training staff, preparing staff, and also transitioning their activities into a remote and flexible environment? Again, there was a trend before COVID, but what we've learned since then is that we can look at jobs now and say many of these jobs and occupations can be remote, but we also have to be cognizant of the many jobs that cannot be. And those are usually the lower wage workers. We had people that were going into the grocery stores while people were staying home, collecting that extra $600. Everybody didn't have the availability to do that because they were an essential worker. And those essential workers were your, transportation, the MTA, the grocery stores, home health aides. And even when they were low wage workers, we saw the need for how much we needed and depended on those individuals. And we've seen now, although, as I said, we've done our shares of Zoom meetings. I could have a day where I have 4 or 5 of them in one day. It still surprises me, by the way, that people don't know where their mute button is, but you know, or they don't know how that they're didn't do it right, and we're hearing all their background noise and calls coming in. But we know we have done a lot of, you know, transition to that environment. One of the things that we have been very clear about is that we need to train workers in working in a remote environment, in a Zoom environment, that it is, and also students themselves and learners. This is not about getting up 10 minutes before you have to sign on and be in your pajamas or whatever. And this is about how do you work in a remote environment. And we have actually needed to do that with our own staff. We're putting together, and we have put training together for people to understand that remote and flexible work, and offering it to the business community as they are also grappling with some of these issues. So we have our vision, which we started years ago on this virtual services. And we've had to do a lot of rethinking on what we do and how we do it. As part of this workforce development infrastructure, we cannot just continue to open up our career centers if we're not able to keep people safe by social distancing, being able to make sure people are coming into our centers and they have face masks. We need to protect our staff as well as the customers that are coming in. So one silver lining to the COVID from our perspective is that it has given us an opportunity to push forward many of the ideas that we've had over the years and people have been resistant to say now is our opportunity to think very creatively about how we engage our customers on the workforce development, looking for work, finding new work, preparing them for interviewing, resume writing, all of those kinds of services, but thinking about it in a different way. The unprecedented increase in unemployed individuals has meant that we have to make a massive shift to how many people we are able to outreach. We cannot do that on a one-to-one as much as we want to do that. We have to start vetting through who really needs our services, who really needs to engage, and who are the individuals that have the skills to be able to do that on their own, but provide them with those products in a public employment system that is at no cost to them. So, you know, we want to talk about our vision for a system that is a modern, a digital experience, user-friendly, available on any kind of device, because the majority of individuals will have their mobile device. It doesn't mean that they have computer, but they will have a mobile device that we want to make sure we're able to connect with them on, and we can provide them those services. We want a system that has built-in artificial intelligence, that the tools are there for real-time data, real-time job openings, a system that is customized to each user and their unique career paths and needs. We want to make sure that we are providing our services in other languages so that we can engage all customers and all users, including those who are not necessarily tech savvy and those that need adaptive technology. We want to make sure we are also interfacing with our business customers. Important for us to make sure that business can access our talent. They can look to see what kind of opportunities they need to think through, how they're describing their jobs, working with us on making sure that these are talent that's coming in, that we are able to keep businesses in New York. As Melinda mentioned, I have been involved in the Regional Economic Development Council process since day one. I am going to continue to be on that in that work because it is so important for us to understand the economic drivers within a community and how we are assisting the businesses and the talent that they need, and to make sure that we are being responsive to that. So we have been actively looking at the virtual services. And in fact, we just went under contract with a virtual job fair tool. They're developing the platform. We're hoping within the next month or so, we'll be able to develop and hold virtual job fairs. People might remember, I know Melinda does, but we used to do those a few years ago. And we grew, but the technology at that time had really not grown. And we want to be able to offer our businesses to come in, to have their own booth, to be able to talk and have our job seekers visit that booth, leave their resume, get applications, have interviews scheduled at that time. And so we looked at many different products that were out there. We needed a product that could handle our traffic that we know we will have. People started getting very used to the Department of Labor having large customized recruitments as well as large job fairs. And we want to not disappoint and have people move away from us being the conduit for bringing job seekers and businesses together. We are looking to roll out training that helps the businesses and job seekers with best practices on how to make sure your job fair experience is a good one. So we're looking at what are those tools that we need to build that experience before they actually get into that experience. But we believe that it will change the lives of many people that are going to be looking for work. We really have been doing a lot of work over the past, year and a half with our post-secondary and high schools and our K through 12 and our post-secondary trainers. And we want to be able to offer virtual job fairs for those college students, high school students that want some other opportunities, internships we want to build into this, externships. And so we're really very excited about that. We're also looking at the virtual learning and training. We are very excited about a partnership that we hope that we're going to be able to announce very soon. It will be an online at no cost to the individual to participate in thousands and thousands of courses connected to individual credentialing. And we're going to be looking at even some New York State specific credentialing that if you take a series of these courses, you will be certified at the state level for those entry into those occupations. We're excited because we've been working with SUNY Online and SUNY Empire State College. They're leaders and they have been leaders in this. How do you build an online experience? How do you give people credit for the work that they've already done? And how do we transition that into career planning? So our virtual learning and training tool will have a career planner that can assist them with, these are the skills that you have. What are the needs for your labor market that you're looking to either you're in or that you want to move to? And so we're going to be focusing on some industries with high demand and high growth. Of course, we all know that IT, healthcare, warehousing and logistics has become absolutely huge. But we also want to make sure that, and as Melinda said, that we're not just focusing on the same businesses, but how do we engage other industries, large industries, as well as our customers to see there are other opportunities out there for them as they have to start transitioning. There are a lot of businesses out there that need to upskill their workers. We know that. So we want to make sure we're including the incumbent worker in any kind of virtual tool. We know resources are limited. So we want to make sure that as many of the opportunities that we can offer, that we can purchase, if you will, on these online systems are not being charged to anyone, that the state is going to be covering it. But we also know at the local level, we do a lot of, of gearing people up for tuition assistance, helping them with TAP and Pell. The local areas have some tuition assistance program. We want to make sure that veterans understand all their resources. And so this virtual center, if you will, is going to be much more about everyone coming in and finding the resources that fit their particular needs. We are looking at, and we have already used a tool for virtual interviews. It's Interview Stream that we've been using in our career centers. We still have been using that with our customers as we're providing virtual services. And this is an opportunity for people that are maybe resistant to come into a brick and mortar. They're embarrassed. They don't want to go through how do you do an interview, but we can work with them for them to take questions as if they are on an interview, and then have a specialist look at them and help them and guide them in some of the pros and cons that they've seen as how they've responded to the questions. It also allows us to help those that are in second chance programs and so on to know what they need to answer and what they're not required to answer. So while we have been using this for the last several years in our career centers with our customers, we know that we are going to be actually bringing this into a whole larger realm of offerings to people as they're looking for these virtual services. And then how are we looking at bridging this digital divide? And both Lizette and Melinda talked about it. It's not even just about broadband access. It has been clear that with the cost of any of our systems that access and provide us with internet and so on, outrageously expensive for many of our families, and in particular for those that are low-wage workers. And they're trying to do this for their children because now everything is going remote or part of their day is remote. So we don't want to leave anyone behind, and we have to find new ways to close that. And as Melinda mentioned in the report, very well done report. I commend them on bringing all of those individuals in different perspective together. Some of this is a no-brainer, and some of it is still for us to figure out how does that get rolled out, and a lot of policies that have to be brought together. And my partner in crime, who is Mathri Komareddy, who is the executive director of the Governor's Office of Workforce Development, her and I, speak together all of the time, several times a week at least. And we know that we need to start looking at what are those policies that at a state level, again, we can be drivers in what should be national policies. And yes, we must be nimble. Boy, we felt we were being nimble. We know that many people, and all of that has been happening, has said, why is it taking us so long to do this? I think that what we have learned over, the 7-8 months is that people do look for government and for outside community partners. That's where they go for assistance. They need people that understand and can speak with them. And we think by providing our partners at the community-based level, our colleges, high schools, whatever needs to see how do you engage people in a career development opportunity, whether it be apprenticeships. We've been working, for internships, externships, but also how do we do on-the-job training for people so that they are earning a wage while they are learning. The apprenticeship program is a learn and earn program, has been so successful to us, but how do we engage more industries into that model so that people are working and engaging and they are actually learning new skills, but they're actually in a place where they are making a living as well. And so I want to end with that. And again, thank you for this opportunity. A lot of work to do, but it's a very exciting space to be in.
Thank you, Karen. We have time for some questions, and I would note to our everybody who's attended, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom. I think everybody's probably getting pretty Zoom proficient. I've heard that there's a term now called Zoom fatigue. You're zoomed out. You know something's in the zeitgeist when it becomes a noun, a verb, an adjective. So this is where we are now. And to start off, there were a couple of questions posted in the chat, or in the Q&A, I should say. So I'll start with the first one, and this is directed to all three of you. So if you want to start, maybe Lisette, you answer first, then Melinda, then Karen. But somebody who was left, but I think this question will still interest all of our audience, pertains to older workers. Would love to hear more on older adults workforce strategy. So what strategy should you do three you think should be pursued for older workers? Because now we no longer have mandatory retirement. You can just work to the end of your biological clock if you want to. So Lizette, if you want to go first.
Sure, I think that this question of vulnerable workers, when you look at the stats, and Karen emphasized this, and also Melinda did too, you particularly look at older women, right? And say, are they vulnerable right now? And yes, they are. And they have been vulnerable before COVID, right? So let's make this clear, right? Hiring older workers was a vulnerability before. But now when you tie that to the fact that they may be the primary breadwinner for a family and taking care of a family, there's greater risk there. So, there needs to be this dedicated strategy. I actually really appreciated seeing the amount of work that was coming out under Karen and talking about being really strategic about what are the things we can do remotely that can re-engage and bring people in. The assumption is that retraining is the same thing as Melinda said. That means they didn't have a degree, it was going to take all this time. No, there are some things that we call tweaks that can get someone back into the job market. So there's a difference between someone who's in their 50s who has never really been engaged in the job market to someone who has and recently lost their employment. But those who recently have and lost their employment, we know we can be doing better than we have. And that goes a lot to the strategies that Karen was talking about and integrating them, and Melinda was talking about. So I actually think that some of those, I saw that question and that person had to leave, but I actually saw some of those concerns being addressed primarily in Karen's presentation at the end.
Thanks, Lisette. Melinda?
So I think one of the things I've learned is that anytime we look at a special population and assume they're all the same, we're making a major mistake. And so I think if we assume that everyone who is an older New Yorker doesn't know how to use a computer, like that's the wrong assumption, right? And so I think one of the things that I would say is, and it goes back to what Lizette shared, is you really have to understand the needs of the population you're trying to serve and the specific people you're trying to serve. Because if you are recently unemployed, you may have a whole wealth of skills that could be reattached to the labor market, which is very different if you're trying to transition, say, from a sector where you haven't had to use technology to a sector where you need technology. So really the pathways are very different, which is why, again, I think the tools that Karen are describing are so important, because everyone's path isn't necessarily the same. There's certainly some customization that has to happen across the workforce system, but that's also why the workforce system is so important. Because you need support when you're going through that process. The last thing that I will mention is if there are literacy needs, specifically meaning literacy and technology needs for older workers and older individuals, there's a really great organization in New York City called OATS, which I think some folks have probably intersected with before. They have an incredible set of trainings that they provide specific to older adults around accessing the computer, but also around telehealth, which I think, again, in some ways is our in to be able to continue to expand access to broadband and tech, is because telehealth has become so incredibly important as part of this COVID recovery.
And the one thing I'd like to add is that, there is a lot of concern for the older worker to get back into a workplace right now because they are the vulnerable age in many instances. And so we also need to understand that while we have to figure out what are those supports, right? That it is so important for us to make sure that we're continuing to talk about federal and supports, if you will, to allow people in this pandemic to be able to be home and to be able to collect, because they're not all feeling safe that in the environment, maybe the job that they were in, while the business wants to bring them back. And we are getting businesses that are saying, I wanted them to come back and they wouldn't come back, and so they shouldn't be collecting unemployment or whatever. And it really isn't. There is another reason, another level. While that is a targeted population, it is a hard, population for us to say, just bring back in. So I think it will be, as we talked about, transitioning of the skills into maybe other work, or being able to make sure that they're comfortable being in a remote environment and finding those jobs that they might be able to do that work in.
Thanks, Karen. I'm based in Empire State College's location in Buffalo, more accurately Cheektowaga. As I'm sure the three of you know, there's been a longstanding economic disparity between downstate and upstate. How do you think COVID has impacted that difference, and how will it change, or what will it mean for the difference between upstate and downstate as we come out of it? Lisette, if you want to go first.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think there was a downstate, upstate pre-COVID and not. The mobility that people have exercised as a result of moving from the cities, people will always go where there's more affordable housing. You will just see that. So we're seeing some really interesting moves that are happening. And I think that's actually changing some of even upstate a bit, right? So I just want to acknowledge that there is some geographic movement in ways we didn't anticipate, we didn't expect, right? So what does that also mean too? Upstate's becoming more diverse than it's been before, right? But this is ways we have to think about that. And so there are strains on systems because they're probably not prepared for maybe the populations that are coming in. This is what we've seen, right? So this was pre-COVID. COVID can exacerbate that. I do still think that there's opportunity in this pandemic to think about what does it mean? There isn't a single employer right now that is not rethinking this idea of work as a place-based strategy, right? I just talked to someone who said 30% of my workforce is not where they were at the beginning of the pandemic, right? This was just a company of about maybe 100 people, right? A small company, right? And they were like, well, maybe we should just permanently go remote and think about employment as being much more mobile in that way. And I actually think that really changes how we think about talent. And I think upstate is going to see a very different way of engagement in the way that we haven't seen it before. Now does that present challenges? Sure. And sure, downstate might have some challenges around that, but I do think that we haven't seen this. And I will tell you, even myself, and I think about my team, coming back together, it's not going to be the same normal. It's not. And I will tell you, particularly people who've commuted, it's going to be a really different way of thinking about what does it mean to go back to what was normal. So that means upstate is in a way for capturing talent because of mobility.
Thanks, Lisette. Melinda?
So I am a true New Yorker in that I've lived almost everywhere, I feel like, in New York. I used to joke and say I would never live where there wasn't a Wegmans. And then, of course, I left Brooklyn and Wegmans came in. So I'm just waiting in Albany for the Wegmans to arrive. Here's what I will say to our New York City folks. Upstate New York is a real place that is vibrant with really strong employment opportunities throughout the state. I think that one of the big differences is in some places, in rural places, there's a real reliance on small businesses. I look at Ulster County, for example, 99% of their employers have less than 10 employees, right? And so again, it goes back to this concept of really how we think about the stabilization of our small business community, but also I think a reinvestment in entrepreneurship to rebuild and restructure many of the business opportunities that have been lost. I also think that there needs to be a look at the way that we create investment opportunities for women minority-owned businesses. I know the governor's been invested in that and supporting that, but access to capital is a real and significant issue for many entrepreneurs across the state. And so I say all this to say that I think we often think that upstate and downstate have very different issues. We really don't. We have very similar issues that require a little bit of a different approach. But again, some of the challenges with unemployment in the Bronx are very similar to the challenge with unemployment in the North Country. And so I think also that's why I think an upstate downstate vision is really important when we think about advocacy and the approach to a workforce strategy.
Thanks, Melinda. Karen?
Well, you know, I think we are seeing people from the city that are saying, well, hey, I can work remotely anywhere, you know, and if their jobs are going to truly continue to be in a remote, they're looking, as Lisette said, to places where they can buy a home so that they have a yard and they're not on top of people because of the pandemic really frightened a lot of people. A lot of people from the city went to their second homes and haven't come back. They're like, hey, I'm good here. So I think that what I would say for upstate communities is that they need to be open to diversity. We've had upstate areas that they are not as inclusive in understanding that you need to build or offer or allow for restaurants to open that are, very different than, your American tavern kind of thing, or where are they going for entertainment and where are their community centers so that they can come together, their churches. And so we have spoken to local areas over the years to say, if you really want to, or you're afraid of the fleeing out of your city or your county, start looking at how are you being open, because in the virtual world of services, you really have an opportunity now to, and by the way, people are saying, hey, I'll go up and travel an hour and a half, 2 hours upstate, because sometimes when traffic is downtown or you can't, or I don't want to get on the subway system, I'm willing to do that. So I think we're looking at and working with ESD entrepreneurship, as Melinda said. The self-employment program is, we want to put some resources and start trying to figure out how do we make sure that we're not putting people through a lot of hoops on how they become in the self-employment assistance program, which is really basically an unemployment benefits where they can open their job, look for work. They don't have to look for work, but they can devote their time and energies to that self-employment or their new opportunity. So we're looking at that as a way to help upstate as well as downstate, where they have so many creative minds that this is their opportunity to do something a little different.
Great, thank you. One last question. How do you see COVID impacting underemployment and discouraged workers? There was already a problem with measuring people who had left the workforce. How much worse will COVID make this going forward? Lisette?
COVID should almost be a euphemism for laying bare what was previously existing and just putting it on steroids out there, right? That's what we're dealing with. It's the negative, but also the positive. One is the nimbleness for acceleration that we have, right? Like I hope as folks listen out there, no one underestimates what does it mean to have a public sector workforce and redirect them to a whole new role. So Karen, thank you for that, because that was unbelievable. We all read those stories, right? So yeah, I think that we're going to continue to see that challenge. I think that we don't want to waste this crisis in the sense of, because we've pushed the boundaries of technology, there isn't a single person around the table who's not asking, what should we be tracking? In a way that is, we haven't asked in many years. I'll be honest with you, right? I'm seeing that. I know I'm in those rooms, you're in those rooms. So yeah, that's still a problem. But I actually think in the next couple of years, we're going to be collecting data we hadn't thought about collecting, because now we know that we can see the needle of improvement on it. I will also say the last thing is when we're thinking up potentially another stimulus package, what is going to be the impact of that package requires us to track that data a little bit more, Jason, in a way that we've done in the past. And that is not just, that's for the everyday person to understand, but also it's for political environments too, to be able to talk about the value of the stimulus.
Thanks, Lisette. Melinda?
I wish I was as optimistic as Lisette. I think there are certainly good things, but I see the income divide that has already happened and the worsening of that divide really being something serious we have to contend with. Where I see, again, things that are bright spots, if folks have not spent time on Opportunity Insights website on Harvard's website, the amount of big data that they're being able to combine to show better, to help us better understand the impacts in real time, because what we lack as a system is real-time information. It's really hard to provide that and present that with the systems we have. All labor market data is backward-looking, right? Like this helps us predict forward-looking work. And so the opportunity we have now to really think about the combination of consumer spending, the real estate prices, plus unemployment data, plus impact data around school attendance, like that's where we're going to start to see new and better and different information. But it does require investment. investment, right? We have to see data as sexy and something we want to invest in. And it's always hard to make that argument when there's human beings who are suffering. And so I say that because I think there's an important opportunity for us to really think about those systems building activities in addition to the reemployment work that is going to be critical to our recovery.
Thanks, Melinda. And the final word to you, Karen.
Well, I will say that we know of more customers now because of the fact that they came into our system, even if they were self-employed and are not going to go back to that work. And maybe they were discouraged and started their own business. And now they're trying to find, how do I re-engage in that, right? We have 4.8 million people right now in our case management system, if you can believe it. So I think there's going to be people that are going to be discouraged. What I think is this infrastructure that we're building is to make sure that we're doing some real career planning and letting people know that, as Melinda and Lisette said, there's data out there that can tell you, here's jobs in your area that are going unfilled. And everybody gets those businesses all the time. And people don't know, well, how do I get there? And when you're not in the, and if you are already working, you don't have the time to do that. But as we start building these unlearning tools, and how we can connect even through the virtual career centers and career planning, we need to get those people that have been discouraged to say, what is the right fit and what can you do that's not going to cost you any resources, but you might have to commit your nights and weekends and so on to trying to build some of those skills. I think it's going to be a long time before we really bounce back when the hotel industry and so on says, probably, 2022, 23. You're already right there saying, wow, that's a lot of jobs, a lot of restaurants, a lot of tourism that we're losing in the state. So we've just got to be optimistic and continue to figure out how do we help those people the best we can with the resources that we do have, or the resources that we need to build on.
Thank you, Karen. I'll turn it back over now to Laura Schultz at Rockefeller.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Lizette, Melinda, and Karen. I think this was an important conversation because we have a long 2 or 3 years ahead of us, but we're now have a clearer view of the challenges facing the labor force in New York nationally. And we also have the opportunity to innovate and rethink our infrastructure and to make changes in the way that we get workers into careers and opportunities that are going to create good lives for them. And I think it's an important conversation and one that we should continue to have over the next 2 or 3 years as the recovery continues and hopefully completes in not too long term. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will be posting this webinar, a video of this webinar on our website so that you'll be able to access it. And in the next couple of weeks, we will post all of the resources like the report that Melinda was referring to and a couple of other valuable resources so that people can follow what's going on in workforce development. And thank you, and we look forward to having this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, be well.